Hi, I'm Brian McDonald, editor with O'Reilly Media. I'm here today with Tom Dale and Yehuda Katz, the creators of Ember, and we're going to talk a bit about the framework wars. So, is the framework war a real thing?
I think war is probably a little bit of a loaded term. We've had a bunch of really great conversations here at Fluent with the creators and maintainers of our competitors, our enemies, I guess you would say. But I think there's been a lot more light than heat. Mm-hmm. I think the discussion that's going on here at Fluent and on the web in general is you have all these things that, at a 30,000 foot view, it seems like they're doing the same thing. Right. And you really need the right vocabulary, you need the right understanding of all of these to figure out which one is most appropriate to use in your app.
And I think which one is most appropriate based on the kind of thing the kind of person or developer you are, right? Mm-hmm. Different developers may prefer different trade-offs.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think framework war is a little bit of a misnomer, both for the war part and also for the framework part, because framework is such a dirty word in JavaScript that all the other libraries and toolkits and everything are doing Cirque du Soleil level contortions to avoid being labeled a framework, and I think they try to skirt around the issue. Whereas I think from the beginning, Yehuda and I both knew, despite the fact that the environment wasn't necessarily welcoming to frameworks, hospitable, we knew that we wanted to build a framework, and I think we've owned that since day one.
So I think maybe like toolkit wars would be better. I think if you watch our talk, you'll see that we specifically talk about like how do you differentiate between what a toolkit is and what a framework is, and basically you can observe that Ember is bigger than Angular, which is bigger than Backbone, and I think our talk sort of went into like what is that extra code doing?
Right.
Like each one of those things adds code, and they're doing something, and I think people historically have just poo-pooed Backbone partisans poo-poo the extra code that Angular adds, and Angular partisans poo-poo the extra code that Ember adds. But clearly it's doing something, and I think to just say, oh, well,
they're basically the same.
It's totally useless. Basically, this extra code is totally useless in practice. I think people should observe is obviously wrong.
Okay, so what's the benefit to me of having a framework as opposed to a toolkit?
Well, I think, again, kind of the point of the talk is that a framework is designed to nudge you in the right direction, right? The problem, a lot of people describe things like Backbone or Angular as being very flexible, and we agree that they're more flexible than Ember, flat out. But what flexible means is that it makes doing the wrong thing feel the same as doing the right thing. And I think a framework is about kind of encoding these conventions into the DNA of the API. Right. So that when you start doing something that is counter to how you should be doing it, there's a little bit of friction. It kind of just it's like a guardrail. It gently nudges
and I think importantly, there really is the notion of the right way and the wrong way to do this. You can observe that on the internet there are best practices guidelines for Angular and Backbone. You can observe that Angular developers who are experienced will often tell you you're doing it wrong. So I think the idea that, well, there really is no right way and wrong way. It really is totally domain specific. I don't think that really comports with reality. Although it's a nice thing to say if you're trying to make an argument.
Right.
And I think notably, what I was getting at about the extra code is that a thing like Ember is conceptually a thing like Angular plus these best practices guardrails. And so, of course, a thing like Ember is going to have more code. But really what that code is buying you is you not having to invent it on your own. And I think when Angular says Angular is a toolkit for building your own framework, what they mean is that you're going to have to build the guardrails yourself. You, as a team, try to identify, think about, debate, argue, look around the community to figure out what other people think are the best practices, talk to experienced developers.
And I think that bears out. Basically, every Angular or Backbone app that we've looked at, whether it's closed source or open source, ends up needing to build that own framework. And the thing that I've also noticed
and I think Angular is saying that you will build. Angular is telling you you will build a framework out of this.
It says it right on their website. It's like their tagline, right? A toolkit for building, framework for your app. And I think that's great. But as your application grows, it's fine for small apps. But as your application grows, the genericness of that solution that you're building approaches Ember. Basically, every big app that I look at that's Angular or Backbone has a very poor version of the Ember conventions built on top.
So I think there's two things to note here. First of all, two reasons why something like Angular might be more appealing. So number one is some developers just prefer to come up with solutions on their own all the time. Right. And I think if you're such a developer, you will find Backbone or Angular more pleasant because they basically, as a guiding principle, want to give you the flexibility to choose on your own what the right thing is. So if you are such a developer, and Ember can't touch that. Even though we have the flexibility under the hood, the community is going to tell you all the time that you're doing something wrong, right? And then there's also like, you are actually trying to do a thing that is quite afield from what Ember's best practices are trying to enshrine. I think if you try to do that with Angular, you're going to find that all the guidance on the internet isn't very helpful to you. But you could like just go off and start doing something totally different. And I think for both of those reasons, it's good that things like Angular exist because they help people who either are just personally predisposed to flexibility or people who are doing something quite different. They help them have the tools.
Or if you're working on something very small, if it's just you, if you can keep all the conventions and the rules of the objects in the system in your head, Angular is a completely fine choice. I think Ember especially shines when working on teams, where you're not enforcing convention via code review, that you're baking it into the framework. And any place where you're building a larger app where you can't keep the entire code base.
I think one nice dividing line for me is if your application has navigation. If your application is just one thing and it routing is done by your server and then it just is a single page app. I think then you'll find that the line where the best practices really come into play is more fuzzy, and like Angular basically gives you enough tools to get there. But I think once you start adding in navigation and how do you set up and tear down things as you move around your application, and how do you think about what objects are available, so you click on a link and now you need to have a model in your template. How did that model get there? How did it get there if you were coming in from the URL? These are all things that you have to figure out if you're writing either an Angular app or an Ember app. But it turns out that they're mostly the same. Everybody does mostly the same thing. And so, and I think that we made this point in our talk. When we started, we were really more similar to something like React.js or Angular. And the reason why we ended up going down this path is that when we looked at all the applications that were doing various things, what we observed is that they were all doing roughly the same thing, or similar enough minus trivial distinctions. So we said we really want to give people some tools that do the right thing for you and not make every single application.
Especially at the time, like 2 or 3 years ago, this is when every JavaScript app that you used felt totally broken. The back button was broken, the refresh was broken. And we realized, like, hey, if you're going to be pushing more of your app to the client to be running in the browser, you really need good URL support. And that's why the router in Ember isn't just a checklist. It's not like, like you never see someone in the Ember community being like, oh, I don't really like the Ember provided router. Let me break it out and we'll use the community version.
I'll use like Sammy.js.
We'll use Sammy.js. This doesn't happen, right? The router is central. It's the heart and soul of any Ember app. And I think to us, it's very, very important, right? The more you're pushing it off, you really, really need good URL support. And that's, I think, what, to Yehuda's point, if you're still leaving all the routing on the server, if you're using Rails or Django or Node, and that's the thing deciding what gets shown when the URL comes in, totally fine, totally plausible. Where Ember really shines is where you're saying, I'm going to actually be pushing so much to the browser that I want that snappy navigation.
So I think to put it a little bit more concretely, maybe, if you have a single page app, then there is a flow that every single application has, which is you have a URL, that URL gets converted into a model, possibly asynchronously, then the model somehow finds its way into the template, which gets rendered and maybe is kept up to date, and maybe you can save things back to the server, right? And if that's all you're doing, it's really easy to imagine, it's easy to see how you can just write that imperatively, right? It's like, the thing I just described is easy. But what if instead of that flow, you have many of that flow, and you're navigating between them. So you go from a list of articles to an individual article to the about page to a page about a user, right?
You don't get a clean slate. These are long-lived apps.
So now you have to think about, okay, I'm going from an article to a page about a user. So now I have to think about how to download the user model and put it into the template and whatever, but I can't just rely on the URL. I have to actually also rely on the state that exists in the application. And now it just becomes, it's not impossible to do imperatively, it just becomes a thing that you are now having to manage and juggle.
Well, it just becomes such drudge work that people just like, I'll get to that later, I'll do that later, and then you end up with busted URLs.
Right. So basically Ember is about saying, look, we have a route, we have a model, we have a controller, we have a template, there's these like slices of functionality that gives us an app. We're gonna say that this is the flow that things go through. If you want to do something when something is loading, there's a clear place where everybody puts it. If you want to do something when the thing errors, there's a clear place that everyone puts it. If you want to store a controller state in your query parameters, there's a clear place where everyone puts it. And it tries to say, if everyone could get on the same page about what it is that we're building architecturally, then we can actually add functionality that helps everybody, that requires very little code.
So if we agree on what we're doing, then we have the tools to make it easier to do it.
I think developers love trivial choices, like what should I name this file? What should I name this controller? And I think Ember really tries to say, stop wasting your time on trivial choices. everyone basically does variations on a theme. Let's just pick one of those variations and call that canonical, and that way the whole community can stop wasting time on this trivial stuff and start building.
Well, and I think notably, if everyone's using these flexible primitives, which I think Angular is really good at, is providing things like directives which are super flexible. It's really hard to have additional functionality that's layered on top, because now you can never know like what someone is actually doing. So even though there might be like an 80% case, everyone is using an element restricted, transcluded, isolated scope directive, and maybe Angular might want to add some additional functionality for that use case. But the fact that it's so many flags that you have to get exactly right means it's really hard for them to add functionality for that case. Where in Ember we have the primary way of writing a component is a thing called a component, which encapsulates all those details. Of course, it's built on top of something that is flexible, and you could drop down to it. But most people will build on top of the component feature, and then that means that Ember can add more features to components, right? Where in Angular, you have to add features to directives, and then you have to think about what does it mean if you're not isolated scope? Like, what does that do?
There's so many permutations. Right? There's so many permutations.
So you can't add, it's not as easy to add a new abstraction on top of directives as it is to add a new abstraction on top of element restricted, transcluded, blah, blah, blah. But of course, you can't tell an Angular user, you can only get this directive feature if you happen to check all these checkboxes in exactly the right way, right? And I think you could, I think maybe to note, you could imagine an Angular group appearing and they say, we're not just going to let you inject anything into anywhere. We're not going to let you write any arbitrary directives. We're going to use the primitives, these flexible primitives, to build something on top. And I think that would be great, and I think the Angular community would benefit. But I think it's important to note that community will probably be far smaller than the Ember community, right? Because the Angular community is very big, but for example, the Backbone Marionette community, which is trying to add some more structure, some more conventions around things, is much smaller than the Ember community, right? And I think what ends up happening is that if you don't have a core team of one of the big players say, look, we're going to actually do this convention over configuration thing, then you end up with small communities that are trying to do it, and they're trading on sort of the idea that Angular is very popular, but you're not really writing an Angular app at that point. You're writing an Angular, opinionated Angular app. And again, I think it would be good for the Angular community if there was a niche group that was trying to say, no, everything is not the same, right? Any kind of directive is not the same. Any kind of dependency injection is not the same. You have to actually, doing it in a particular way will be easier, will be sweeter, and doing it in the other way will be a little more painful. And I think doing that would be good. And maybe Angular can even start rolling some of this in. But I think it's a thing you have to choose. You have to say, I am willing to do that. And I think in the JavaScript community today, people who say, I want to do that are saying that I want to build a framework is kind of like you're basically signing yourself up for being constantly attacked for, really everything is domain specific. Really, there is no best practice. And I hope that the one thing that came out of our talk is that people should not accept the idea that there is no more best practice thing to mine above Angular. Basically, Angular is the list of best practices, and there's no point in building any more opinionated layer on top, because once you get above Angular, it's basically too domain specific. I think hopefully in our talk we convince people that there are more levels. There are more. Maybe it's not. Maybe you go up and you're now at 99% or 95%. But I think it's worth keeping on going up and building something for 95%, even if it means that the 5% is harder.
Right. Let's talk a bit about community for a second. You mentioned, there a lot of different communities want a lot of different things. So how would you characterize the Ember community?
I'd say for people that it's definitely smaller than Angular. It's probably smaller than Backbone at this point, I would imagine. But I think what's really impressive about the Ember community is it's people that really care about building quality software. They're people that are passionate. They know that they're building an app. They know they're not building a page and sprinkling some JavaScript on it. They know that they're building an app. And if you look at the companies that are using and shipping Ember, it's perhaps surprising. It's perhaps surprising, Vine just launched an Ember app, NBCnews.com is an Ember app. They're big companies, and I think they're not interested in the hipsterism of the JavaScript community. They're not interested in saying, oh, it's so flexible, it feels so nice, oh, so many small modules. They're saying, how do we get work done? How do we actually get the job done? Especially on a large team.
Right.
And I think we actually have a list if you go to the Ember website, and there's a Google Doc floating around of people who are collecting all these apps, and I was blown away. It was staggering to me how many big companies. Yahoo is another big one. Yahoo just rewrote their ad manager to buy ads on Yahoo. It's all powered by this really insanely awesome Ember app. It's very fast, very responsive. So I would say that I think we're okay with being smaller than the Angular community or the Backbone community, or really any other thing, because like Yehuda said, will always be bigger than the opinionated subsets.
Right. I think Ember will always be the single biggest set of opinions, and I think Rails is actually a good analogy here, where Rails itself is maybe 5% of the server-side space. It's really not the major player. PHP is maybe the major player, or maybe Java, right? But Rails is much bigger than the next biggest opinionated stack, right? Oh. So how many people are using Cake PHP or even something like Play? It's a much smaller set of people than people who are using Rails. And I think the reason for that is that Rails really embraces the idea that it's building opinionated software, and that as the ecosystem develops, as more and more best practices become pop out, that they get rolled into Rails over time. So that's why, you look at Rails 3, Rails 4, there's these new asset pipeline came in, like how you handle bundling your gems. And the reason these features come in is because over time, more and more people, more and more of the right way to do things coalesced around a single thing, and then that gets rolled into the framework. And you really have to be building a framework that is trying to do that. That is not trying to be ultra flexible. Like perhaps you could say, oh, why should we support Bundler? We'll just Bundler as the package manager. We'll just say you can plug in whatever package manager. But no, that's not really how opinionated software works, right? Opinionated software says, this is the thing that we think that it will work for 95% of people, and maybe we'll provide an escape file so that you can use something else if you don't want, but most people are going to use this, and then we're going to build an ecosystem that can take advantage of the fact that we're building more and more layers of opinionated conventional software. And I think that's I think Ember will always be the single biggest set of opinions, where Angular is based so flexible that it can encompass a lot of sets of opinions, and in total, that's going to be.
And I think the fact that we've been saying this for a long time now meant that early on we attracted some really awesome developers, and I think if you look at innovation happening in JavaScript in the browser, a lot of that now is coming from the Ember community. So like promises. We adopted that early on, and a lot of the feedback that's now actually ending up in TC39.
Right.
Yeah. So it is actually a good example, because Angular adopted promises pretty early as a thing, but Angular only recently has made their promise system compatible with like the general JavaScript promises. And the reason for that is that they shipped promises. They like checked the checkbox. It was a feature, but they didn't really keep iterating on what happened when people actually use promises in the real world. And when we ship a feature, if it turns out that it doesn't mesh well with what people are doing, we're like, oh my, like we wrote an inspector pane that actually shows you all the promises, what errors happen, because we realized very quickly that there were some serious issues, and we went to the browser vendors, and that's basically how the Ember community engages with features. Is everybody's trying to get on the people. It's not enough for us to say, oh, we'll just give you this. You just type, like an example is you type .done, and that will rethrow exceptions. And we said, well, you could tell everyone in the universe that they always have to type .done.
Don't forget.
Yeah. Or we could like build debugging tools. We could try to improve the spec, right? And I think that is really I think the Ember community. We've sold the message of trying to get on the same page so effectively that the Ember ecosystem really tries to get on the same page, and it doesn't prioritize flexibility and, oh, I'll go off and build, oh, I don't like it, I'll go off and build my own variant.
Doing the right thing is actually important, and reaching consensus on what the right thing is. You
don't really see a lot of people saying, let me go off and build my own variant of Ember in my company. And I think we really do not want, like, we would consider that bad if many people were doing it. But I think in all the other toolkits, because they're really they're designed to build a framework, so why would you not build your Google version of Angular or your Yahoo version of Angular, right? Of course you would, because that's the point of it. And I think the idea that if you go into like we looked at the Yahoo Ember app, and it's basically laid out and structured, and the objects collaborate in much the same way that our Skylight app happens to work. And I think that's awesome.
And you can actually see the convention if you visit. So I mentioned Vine, NBC News, any of these public websites. Bustle.com is another one. I think it's really cool. You can install the
Ember Inspector.
The Ember Inspector on either the Firefox Marketplace or the Chrome Web Store. And you can actually open it up, and you can see those conventions live on a real page, and you can look at it, and you can see all of these web pages actually decompose in such similar ways. And it actually, I think, proves the point that 90% of what we're doing as web developers is just doing the same thing over and over. 90% of what we do is building CRUD apps. Right. So let's have some tools.
Well, I think just to be clear, Ember is not optimized for CRUD apps specifically. But yeah, 90%. It turns out that there's actually two things. Maybe 70% of what we're doing is literally identical, but then another 20% or 25% is close enough that it's stupid for us to be wasting our time having variations on a theme, right? So basically, I think the 25% is actually what the difference between Angular and Ember is. Actually, Backbone was more of a 50% solution, right? When there was a lot of shit that you can easily, a lot of stuff that you could easily add in. People quickly did it, but Angular, I think, is maybe reaching the limit of the this is literally identical. Like
Right.
you should, like there's no reason why you would do it differently.
Like data binding.
Like everybody basically arrives at a similar data binding approach. But then there's like another big chunk of stuff, which is if I wrote an app on my own and you wrote an app on your own, we might actually type different things in our program.
Right.
But we would basically be doing the same thing, and that's basically what we noticed when we started looking at apps, when we were looking at the router in the first place, is we noticed that obviously some people had a bootstrap file, some people were using dependency injection, but roughly the thing that people were trying to achieve was the same.
Right.
And so our goal is basically to make it so that people the community can get on the same page about that kind of stuff, and then the good news is that once you've gotten there, you can build on top of those
It's like
abstractions.
having a layer of scaffolding ready to go, so you can basically build to the 23rd level or whatever. This is Steve Jobs' quote. You can basically, he was describing Cocoa, but I think it's true for Ember as well. It gives you that scaffolding to start at a much higher level, so you can build that much higher until the whole thing collapses down.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like it's a really exciting time to be a JavaScript developer.
Very exciting.
Yep.
When there's more tools than you can use, it's a good thing.
Yep.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for coming in,
No problem.
taking your
Thank you, Brian.
time, and having this discussion.
Yep. Thank you very much. It was great to be here.
Thank you.